So if we look at the example of Muhammad the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know that one of the great advices that he gave was do not get angry, right? And if we find ourselves becoming angry, he mentioned sit down. Don't stand up when you're angry. And if you sit down and you find yourself still angry, he mentioned that we should lie down as a means of trying to calm ourselves. So it's pointing at a picture of when we're angry, we shouldn't be impulsive because impulsiveness is what gets us in trouble and it can keep us in trouble. And this impulsive nature is actually the nature of the Satan himself. The nature of the Satan is to act on impulse, to act without thinking. So Muhammad the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the prayers and peace and blessings be upon him, and his wisdom regarding the steps in which we should take should we find ourselves becoming angry is to calm ourselves, to think about what it is that may be actually making us angry, and through the calming of our anger, we can find ourselves having a balanced state because anger is an extreme. Anger is an extreme. And as we find ourselves navigating our emotions, that's one of the main dangers of our emotions. Unmanaged emotions, unchecked emotions, which carry us to extremes, whether it be extreme highs or whether it be extreme lows. Both of these are dangerous. And as believers, as Muslims, our goal, as Allah states in the Quran, He created us as a balanced community. So we strive to have balance in everything that we do, even in the sense of maintaining our emotional state. In fact, mental illness or mental health issue itself is the imbalance of one's mental state, such as if one is dealing with a physical health issue, such as high blood pressure, diabetes. This leads to a person having an imbalance. So as Muslims, as believers, we have an obligation to ourselves to maintain our mental health as best as we possibly can and not to neglect it because even our mental health has rights over us. And if we neglect our mental health, we're going to not only be a harm to ourselves, but can also be a harm to others, whether we do it knowingly or unknowingly. So, Al Islam, from an Islamic perspective, if we look at sin, quite often, if we're not careful, we can see sin as this concept of simply just right and wrong. And that's true. It is a right and wrong. However, it's greater than that. And no, when we sin, we don't do any harm to God. We can't harm God when we sin. In the Quran, this word for sin is dhulm. And this same word for sin means to oppress. We find ourselves oppressing our own selves. So if we look at the things that God mentions in the Quran that are sins, we find these sins contribute to our emotional state or the wavering of our emotional state. For example, if God says, don't steal, right? And a person typically doesn't just start and say, I'm just going to start stealing. It starts with something small and they get away with it, or at least they think they get away with it. We know that God sees and hears all things, but they get away with it little by little to the point where now they go from stealing $5, $10, and now they're stealing vehicles, right? So, in this sin, it does harm other people in some cases, but ultimately it harms that individuals, their own very nature, their own selves. So this is just one example, the example that I mentioned regarding stealing. If we look at alcohol, as Muslims, we know that alcohol as well as gambling is actually mentioned in the same verse in the Quran, where God states that alcohol or the use of intoxicants and gambling has been forbidden to you. So, as Muslims, we have been forbidden or has been made unlawful to use intoxicants as well as to engage in gambling. Now, if we look at this from the outer level of things, we'll simply just think that, hey, God said don't do this, God said don't do that. Yes, once again, that's true. But looking at it from an even deeper level, if we look at the impact that alcohol has had on the world, and we know that alcohol, even in this country here in the US, it hasn't always been legal. And because of the financial ramifications of keeping it illegal, the government decided to make it legal. And we see the negative impact that it's had on the entire world, especially here in the US. We know that thousands, if not more, people die from drunk driving each and every year, whether they kill themselves or whether they kill someone else. So God Almighty has given us the ingredients in the Quran. And if you're viewing this, if you're not Muslim, no, God says there's no compulsion in religion. So we're not going to uh, take or tell you what to do. However, it is our obligation to share what God Almighty has shared in the Quran, not as a means of compulsion, but as a means of sharing information. Once again, if we look at marijuana. All right, we know we're living in an age where it's being legalized, and individuals say that hey, it has these amount of benefits. However, God states in the Quran regarding intoxicants within itself, He states that in it is some benefit, but the harm is greater than the benefit. So God, as a result, has made it forbidden. So intoxicants, one. The other part of this is gambling. As I mentioned, we know that people become rich and wealthy through gambling. All right. This is the picture that they show us. But on the greater schemes of things, individuals that develop gambling addictions, not only do they ruin their own selves, but they ruin their families. So, God Almighty, by declaring these particular actions as being sinful, as I mentioned, zulm is the word that's used in the Quran to sin, zulm, which means to oppress one's self, um, can have not only a negative effect on the individual engaging in the sin, but it also can affect the individuals that are surrounding them, and it doesn't affect God in the least.